So thank you, Boaz, and thank you for the invitation to be here. And it's nice to see familiar faces and new faces. And so I'm going to talk about a piece in testimonies that I've come across quite regularly, and I think that we can say a lot about the structure of testimony and the narratives and the cognitive maps in which testimonies follow, which is very interesting to think about. Is it constructed post-war? Is it constructed as the experience is lived? And it's something that we'll never really know, but what we can see is that there is an emergence of a script of retelling that does change over time. And with comparisons, we're able to see how cognitive maps of experience, but not necessarily the stories themselves, but how they are interpreted and understood, is something that does evolve. In terms of the testimonies of child survivors of the Shoah, those who did give a testimony after the war, one of the elements that is prominent, and I would say it's for adult survivors as well, is the issue of the moment in which they lost their families, and particularly for child survivors is the moment in which they lost their parents. This memory, or this fragment, in a sense, is really the collapse of their physical world and their emotional world, because we know, and I think we don't necessarily talk about it often enough, that there are normative experiences, cognitive experiences, emotional experiences that people, regardless of being survivors of the Holocaust, experience in terms of the importance of caretakers in the emotional and developmental world of children. But obviously with the Shoah and with destruction, the trauma of losing a parent or a caretaker during this period isn't only about losing one's emotional mentor, or people who direct through their behavior how you develop emotionally into adulthood, but in the arena of Shoah, the loss of an adult is a loss of a caretaker and a protector and a provider, which is obviously operating in a normal world. But in terms of the Shoah, no protection of children ultimately meant a very little chance of their survival. And what we see with children is obviously those who managed to survive usually found some other caretaker. Their children could not survive by and large on their own under Nazi occupation. So the moment of loss of the parent is one that is central, and yet takes relatively a very small space in testimony itself. So I don't necessarily think that a longer retelling necessarily talks about significance of an event, but an event of losing the last time you see your parents, which is usually a short description, obviously doesn't necessarily lead to elaboration, but does talk about the moment of crisis. Interestingly enough, this moment of separation, the time in which children are separated from their parents, for very young children, is probably for essentially probably the only or very few memories that they actually have of their parents. Whereas for children who were older during the period would have a pre-war memory of relationship, and a memory of their parents as caretakers, as independent human beings. And what happens here during the Shoah, we see the reduced ability of parents to function as caretakers and providers, and in themselves also becoming victims and suffering. So what we see in these testimonies is essentially the conflict that children experience of watching their parents, their agency dissolving, and having to deal with this memory of what their parents were like in the context of Nazi oppression and occupation. Now, the last image is also not only the last memory that they have, but it also becomes a memory that is filled with meaning and prerogative, but it can also be a memory of guilt and unresolved mourning, depending on the circumstances of the separation. In early testimonies, and I think this is what one of the main points of paper is that really the early testimonies, when children are giving testimonies in the Jewish Historical Commission, to Dagob, to the Wiener Library, to all these different, the Prague Jewish Museum, a lot of the times children, Boda, don't always know what happened to their parents. They are still left with a lack of information as to their fate, unless they witnessed their murder. Or we know of the trope of narrative of Birkenau of children being selected to survive, and then for that time, and then asking where their parents are, and the idea of them being told that they have been murdered. The idea that there is no clarity or verification in 1945, 1946 is something that's very much part of their narrative. They're still hoping or wishing that in fact they will be reunited. And the lack of clarification, in a sense, does delay, and we know in sometimes ultimately till the end of their lives, delays the process of mourning for them. But it also leads to a very important moment in which the image of the parent is captured, and the moment of separation. Halima Hoffman is a case where an idea from the Zich archives where parents just disappeared, and she retells in 46 that the story of how she claims, Mommy led me to a certain Polish woman who had washed our laundry, Mrs. Hanu, and that's where she left me. Mommy said she had to register for the camp and that they would shoot me because I was too little to work. Mommy cried and asked me to be nice, to listen to Mrs. Hanu, and she will come back for me. But she did not come back. Mommy left in the morning and did not even say goodbye to me because I was asleep, and I never saw Mommy again. What's interesting is also in the moment of the separation is that she has no idea what happens to her mother. There is a sense, and she has a sense that she's never seen her again. Or is she confirmed that she has died? But also there is a moment of instruction. She asked me to be nice. And a lot of these moments of separation have some sort of instruction by the parent as to how to move and to live, to go through life. Be nice. Or some sort of instruction which becomes a very important part of the parenting that will remain with the child as they move forward and into their adult life. These moments also give us a glimpse into the relationship, even in extreme circumstances, between the parents and their child. The testimony of Marcel Brunner to the Jewish Historical Society in 1945 tells about the last time he sees his mother through the barbed wire in Auschwitz-Birkenau, after him and his father had been deported from Prashov. He recalls, I thought about Mommy all the time, where she is and whether I will ever see her again. They told us that different transports were coming from Prashov. When I saw a woman behind barbed wires, I ran to look, where I could spot Mommy. One day, I saw Mommy carrying bedboards. I went over to the wires and I looked, but Mommy was not among them. Suddenly, one of the women began to call, Marcel, Marcel. I ran. I recognized the voice. It was Mommy's voice. I could not recognize Mommy. No way. She was in rags. She could not stop, and to walk, she had to walk with the others. But I ran along the wires, and that's how we talked. Mommy cried very much. I consoled her. I told her, don't cry, Mommy. Surely everything will come out all right. I ran to the shoemakers and I found Daddy. I told him that I'd found Mommy. Daddy got shoes from the shoemakers and threw them over to the other camp for Mommy because they were adjoining. This was not easy, but somehow it worked. So here Marcel is recording his own instructions to his mother at the last time he sees. Don't worry, everything will be okay. And so we find a sense of agency already in 1945 in understanding his part in the relationship between his and his mother that he couldn't recognize physically anymore, but he could recognize her voice. Interestingly enough, when we have the opportunity to compare testimonies, we also have the idea of how these moments are remembered. Now, Eric Holder, who is a survivor who gives an early testimony and then gives a later testimony in 1998, he also talks about the last time he sees his mother. And he recalls that he wakes up and he sees his mother and father preparing to go to work. And it was still dark outside, and I cried terribly. Mother, don't go, don't go. And I remember they tried to calm me down, And they say that today she would come home earlier, something like that, but that was the last time I saw her. Interestingly, in his earlier testimony, he talks about being separated from his mother and her being taken, but he doesn't recall, he doesn't report the interaction in which he then pleads with her not to go. And I would say that, in a sense, we could also have maybe argued that the later information of knowing that she has died becomes a part of the way it's narrated later on. That now it becomes perhaps, we don't know, his subconscious wish that he had said that, or maybe he did and remembered it differently. But it's interesting to see where reported in speech and how it's enacted enters into testimony, I would argue, later on, as opposed to the earlier testimony, which were more of a report-based nature. We also have instances in when the moment of separation is actually told differently, when we can compare earlier and later. And one of the important examples comes from a David Bode interview with Mark Moskowitz, when he talks about his arrival in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and he's basically on the ramp, and they are being separated at the ramp. And he says in his early testimony in 46, "It was said, craftsman stepped forward, so I reported as a carpenter, and I stepped forward. And then my father said, 'Why do you step forward? Now you will leave me, and I will remain here alone.' I wanted to go back, but I couldn't go back anymore." To his testimony with the USHMM, he tells the same story, and then he tells it a little differently. And they ask people, "Who's got a trade? Who's learned a trade?" And I remember, when I was a young boy, my father took me to a place to learn how to be a carpenter. And he grabbed me and he says, "You go up, tell them you're a Tischler." Tischler means a carpenter. And that's how I got separated from my father. It would be understandable. So now we have an issue of different ways of understanding the separation. And one of the things that we also have in terms of when we compare early and later testimonies is the idea of understanding the relationship and how it evolves. The way that the parent is understood and their behaviour as how they acted during the war over time does shift. It does change. It doesn't mean that the core story of what happened changes, but the way it's interpreted has changed. And I bring two examples for this. One of the examples that I have is an example that came to me from my own work, when I was quoting to an earlier and a later testimony by a woman, Janine Binder, who was interviewed by David Bode in the net run by the USHMM. And in her interview with the USHMM, she talks about the fact that talks about her father in the ghetto. And the question was afterwards, "How were you eating? What were you eating?" And she answers, "You know what? I don't remember. I don't know what we were eating. I don't know how we got our food, but we ate very little. We were hungry forever. I don't know. My father should have been smarter. We should have. We didn't. He should have sold our furniture first. But he didn't do that. Instead, we sold everything else. If we had some gold that we didn't give away, then we sold that first. And this is something you don't sell. This is something that you sew into the lining of your clothes, right? But we didn't do that." So before I published this piece, I sent it to the interviewees who were still alive that could respond to what I'd written about them. And in a phone conversation, she told me that she was very upset, that this is in fact how she remembered her father. And then in fact that it would be a lasting memory of him for generations if it was in the printed book. And she wrote me an email as a follow-up, and she wrote, "I was delighted to speak to you. My commentary about my father makes me feel guilty. Today I don't blame him, neither him or my mother for anything. I know that both of my parents did their utmost to protect me. Had it not been for my father's employment, my mother's pushing me out of the ghetto, among other close calls, we wouldn't have survived. I wouldn't have survived, sorry. My father was caught carrying a sack of potatoes on his back for us to eat in the ghettos, so we wouldn't starve, and that was when they took him to the Janowska camp where he was killed." So here we have a situation of someone who's reflecting on how she's remembered her father, and yet now feels difficult, guilty, that this is the memory that is going to be preserved. What is interesting, though, is that the way she remembered him was, in a sense, that the way she reclaims him is him trying to smuggle food, which is the opposite of what she's accusing him of in the ghetto. And I think this is what is so important about memory work and narrative work, is that so many times the same themes are articulated in different ways, because these are the cognitive maps of the interviewer. One last example that I have in terms of this is something that is also very interesting, but it's also very painful, is the story of Sally Wasserman. Sally Wasserman was basically in a ghetto in Dąbrowa in Poland, and she at some point was approached by a Volksdeutsch man, Mr. Turnek, who used to come and read the meters in the ghetto, and he befriended her and would give her extra food and look after her. And one day he asked her if he could see her mother. Her father had been taken, her mother, it was her mother and younger brother, and essentially Mr. Turnek asked her mother if she gave him permission to smuggle Sally out of the ghetto because he had understood that the ghetto was to be liquidated. And she agreed. And there is a whole scene in her interview of how Sally Wasserman is essentially told by her mother the last time. She recalls her instructions: when they open the gate, go, but don't go in the direction they tell you to go. Go in the opposite direction. Don't turn around. You'll meet Mr. Turkin. He'll be waiting for you. And when they resettle us, he will bring you to our place. She didn't kiss me goodbye, and she told me not to turn around, not to wave, and not to do anything. Just go, she said. Sally is smuggled out of the ghetto. She is hidden for the duration of the war. After the war, she actually gives evidence to the Polish court that basically Mr. Turkin is accused of being a collaborator. She saves him from the death sentence after the war. But her mother and young brother were taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau 2 days later, and they were murdered. Sally spends her entire life being angry with her mother for choosing to go with Vovek and not take her with her in her last moments, and felt that her mother had made a choice, and preferred choice over her brother as opposed to him, how she was sent out of the ghetto with strangers, but yet her brother, who even, despite the fact we were murdered together in Auschwitz-Birkenau, remained with her mother. Now, Sally remembered that she had been given something to carry out of the ghetto with, and when she went to Canada, eventually she was in Poland, she didn't want to leave a rescuers, an aunt found her, she moved to Canada, she immigrated, had a very difficult relationship with her aunt, couldn't stand her aunt, and eventually left her aunt. But she always remembered that she left the ghetto with a package around her waist. And about 10 years ago, Sally asked her aunt, what was the package around my waist? I know that I had one. And her aunt said, I don't know, I have no idea what you're talking about, go and look for it. Basically, and Sally tells a story of how she looked and looked and looked, couldn't find any of the documents that she thought she had, and eventually she went back to her aunt and said, I need to know, this is the last thing I have of my entire family. Where is it? So her aunt said it was written in green ink. And essentially what Sally found was the letter that her mother had written to her aunt in Canada on the eve of the liquidation of the ghetto, telling her aunt about the choice she had made in sending Sally out of the ghetto. And asks her to look after Sharon with care when you find her again. Once Sally finds the letter 10 years ago, she's able to then understand that her mother didn't make a choice that favoured her brother. She made a choice to save her life, and did it with an incredibly difficult decision. And in understanding and reading her mother's words, she was able to now understand that her mother hadn't chosen, hadn't preferred, but instead had done something which was the greatest gift that Sally had, was essentially giving her the ability to survive the Shoah and to live a life. So one of the ideas is that with information that is gathered after the war, through a person's journey and through the information that they can, either of the circumstances or the circumstance of particularly of the individual parents, a different vision of the parent emerges. And one could argue that is obviously normative. Parents, the way we relate to our parents as we get older differs. We have children, you look at it differently than when you're 16, 17, 18 years old. So there are normative processes which affect the way we see our families and our relationships with our parents. But also I think what's very important is that information about their fate and the struggles of what they did at the time becomes appreciated with the more information that a survivor has of the circumstances around the decisions that are made. And also I think what's important is the idea of commemoration. And when Janine understands that this is going to be the last, this is going to be a lasting piece of evidence of the way her father is remembered, an article or a book, she then all of a sudden gets a sense of, well, it's not just about telling what happened or how I felt at the time, but it's also about thinking about how my father will be remembered. And once she passes, what is left are her words. And I think that for survivors of Shoah, the idea of what they have said at different points of their life will be the remaining memories that they have, not only of their lives, but of other people's lives, and particularly their parents, is something that I think is a cause of anxiety. Have I said, have I represented, or not even just told the truth? What is the image that is going to remain after I go? And I will be no longer around to be able to argue with that memory and with that vision. And I think with that, we need, as researchers, to take into account that even though it might not always reflect the historical reality of the experience for the survivors themselves, it talks about the imperative of commemoration and of honouring those that they lost during the war. So thank you.